Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Megan. And thanks, everyone, for taking the time out of your afternoon to join us for this webinar this afternoon. As Megan mentioned, IQ, OQ, PQ, help. What do I do? So a little bit about myself then, so you know who you're listening to. Megan said, my name is John Zank. I am a Director of Delivery here at CSOLS. Been with the company almost 7 years and responsible for the computer system validation group as well as our LabVantage LIMS technical team. Outside or prior to CSOLS, including them as well, I have about 22 years of experience doing computer system validation in the regulated industry across all kind of facets, from large pharma, CRO, vaccines, any of the GXPs, also doing laboratory and enterprise level systems, whether it be local or global implementations, also involved with qualifying infrastructures and networks, working with a lot of IT individuals. And throughout the years, I've been part of audit teams doing both laboratory system audits and data integrity audits, internal, external, vendors, and suppliers as well. So for today, the purpose of today's presentation and the webinar is fairly straightforward in terms of the agenda. So I'd like to set the stage a little bit before I dive in. And really the purpose of that is to kind of level set some of the terminology I'll be using, give a little bit of background, because software validation as a whole is a very a large process. There's a lot of pieces to it. This is just focusing in on IQ, OQ, PQ. So I do kind of want to explain what should come first, where you should be, so you have an idea of what we're talking about specifically today. And then I will take a little bit of time, during the rest of the presentation to go through IQ, OQ, and PQ, each separately. And for each section, what I'll do is go through a little bit of the more specific background for each of the testing types, talk about contents, roles, responsibilities, touch on some pitfalls, some lessons learned that we've had for each, so you get a real good picture of what is required for each of these and what you need to be aware of. And then it's not on here in this agenda item, but at the end I'll circle back around and just kind of give some summary slides and some tips going forward. So I'll set the stage a little bit in terms of IQ, OQ, PQ, and how I'll be using those terms and just how they're referenced out there in the industry. So this table is just a little quick hitter that has a traditional definition of IQ, OQ, PQ because they've been around for a long time. Then I also wanted to throw in a little bit, if you're familiar with GAMP5, which is Good Automated Manufacturing Practices, kind of the industry gold standard, if you will, for how to do software validation. They have a little bit, take a little bit of a twist, if you will, or maybe focused a little bit more on IQ, OQ, PQ terms. So IQ really, between the traditional definition and GAMP, hasn't changed. What we're talking about with IQ is that documented verification that your system has been installed the way the vendor requires it to be installed. So they're going to have the requirements of operating system, memory, whether it's on-premise, hosted, local, thick clients, thin clients, all those type of requirements on how a system gets installed. That's what we're talking about with IQ and qualifying that installation. Jump to OQ, operational qualification. The traditional definition of this is verification that your system is operating according to specifications through specified ranges. So it's really focusing on traditionally the functionality of the system to do the work you need it to do. GAMP5, what has kind of shifted a little bit is being more specific that the OQ is being tied to your functional specs. So with GAMP, if you're looking through there, OQ is defined as documented functional spec testing, verifying the system is operating as it was developed by the vendor. PQ, performance qualification, traditionally, historically, has been that verification that your system can perform its day-to-day activities and processes that you needed to in your operating environment. So really focusing on the performance of the system. GAMP, again, kind of introduced a little bit more of what's really the focus. Is PQ is testing, documented testing that verifies your user requirements, right? And I'll get into these documents in a little bit more detail in the next couple slides, but really performance qualification is user requirements, OQ is functional specs. So I'm sure if you've done validation for a while, you're probably familiar with variations of the V model. So that's why I wanted to put this up here. If you're not, hopefully this gives you a slight introduction to what is considered the V model. And the purpose of this in relation to the webinar today is really to talk about going down the left-hand side of the V. These are the documents that get created to define your system. So you're starting with the user requirements. Those user requirements explain what you need the system to do as an end user. Then those get translated into functional specs, which define how the system works to meet your user requirements. And then those functional specifications can trickle down to the design specifications, which ultimately leads to the system build, right? And that system build is a responsibility of the vendor. So for a lab informatics system, it would be who's ever developing your LIMS or your chromatography system. So once, if you go back up the right-hand side of the V, these are what the focus of the rest of the webinar is the actual testing that links to those specifications and the documents down the left side. So like I mentioned before, IQ, those qualification, or those tests rather, for install qualification are going to be linked to your design. They're going to verify how the system is designed, modules are installed, and it's set up to run in your environment. Then the OQ ties directly to your functional specs. There may be some involvement of your design specs in your OQ, more specific to functionality, and we'll touch on that later. But then your performance qualification or your PQ tests link, as I mentioned before, they verify your user requirements. And then just on the right side, I want to include that vertical arrow there that shows that the responsibility of these tasks and activities start with the vendor doing the system build, and they gradually go up to your responsibility as a regulated company or the end user. Ultimately, you are responsible for showing that the system and verifying that the system works as you intend it to work. But the other parts, you're also responsible for ensuring that those are verified, and we'll get into how that happens. So being that we're talking about IQ, OQ, PQ, I've already hit on a few of these, but just to reiterate, these are the deliverables that should be in place that lead up to the IQ, OQ, PQ. So you should have user requirements and functional specs that have been approved to really understand what you need and how the system's going to do it. You should have a validation plan or a change control. We have experience with clients using different terminology or different documents to scope out how the validation is going to occur. If it's an initial implementation, most often you'll have a validation plan that outlines how you're going to validate the system and define the testing. But if you have a system that's already validated and you're doing an upgrade or maybe a small bug fix, maybe you're going to do it under a change control instead of a validation plan. Ultimately, you should have some document in place that describes your validation process and how you're going to go about doing it. You should have a functional risk assessment in place, and that risk assessment, once performed, should help you define, or the purpose of doing that is to define the scope of your testing. So you can classify things as high level risk, low level risk, medium level risk, but then also define what that means when assigned a risk level. And then you should have a test plan too. And this could be its own document. We've seen it done both ways. Some customers we worked with, their process requires having a test plan, which is its own document that explains the type of testing you're going to do, the level of the IQ, OQ, PQ, and just sets kind of the stage for doing testing. However, we've also worked with customers and clients that build that test plan into the val plan. So it just becomes a separate section of the validation plan. And these combining of documents is, I guess you could look at it first of all of maybe the size or the complexity of your system, right? But I'll just take a minute at this point to say the deliverables that you see here, the things I just mentioned, if you're looking for more information or more guidance on these, we do have other webinars, blogs, and things that you can access that will help there. Really, the intent of the rest of this is to focus solely on IQ, OQ, PQ. Now, the team members that you'll need, or that we recommend, and from our experience, we see most effective for IQ, OQ, PQ process is needing someone who can write your scripts. Script authors is typically what they're referred to. That could be internal staff, usually someone who is well-versed in the system, has been trained at it, understands not only the system though, but also your processes, so they can write the scripts effectively. This is one area where you might outsource script authors if you don't have the right skill set or level. You could outsource it to a consultant group or contractors. You'll need some SMEs. Again, those are going to be highly relied upon as part of the IQ, OQ, PQ process because they'll know your process better than anyone else, or at least that's the hope, and that's what you'd want on your team. And then always want to involve a quality assurance person. Now, you may have other roles involved, IT, system owners, some people say system responsibles. Those are all varied, but at the very least, these three are going to be the key people involved in writing and executing your test scripts. I'll talk specifically about IQ, OQ, and PQ, giving each some of its own time, but there's some basic template contents that go across all three areas. I didn't, rather than repeating this throughout, rather just kind of cover it up front. And we recommend, and we've seen the best use of template creation, so that once you have a template for an IQ script or OQ script or PQ script, you can just use that over and over again through other validations with modifications and tweaks based on the system. But if you're going to build a template, you want a section for scope and approach, so that anyone reading that or the tester knows what's involved. Acceptance criteria, how you're going to use attachments for evidence when you're executing a script, how you're going to handle deviations, discrepancies, or exceptions. This is a tricky term. Some companies don't like to use the term deviation because it's has a much more connotation to it in terms of maybe it requires a CAPA or QA involvement. So which these things do. You do want to have that involvement, but sometimes it's not to the level as a deviation, so discrepancy or exceptions. Essentially how you're going to handle issues that come up. And then the rest of these, I will give some actual examples with some script images for prerequisites, step-by-step instructions. All scripts need expected and actual results, whether it passes or fails, and then initial and date and signatures to verify execution. This is one of the images I was talking about that hopefully provide a little bit a better idea of what, rather than just the text of how these scripts should be written or what the contents are. This image in particular shows how you could use or set up an area in your template for prerequisites. A prerequisite are things that either activities, deliverables, data, whatever is needed to be in place and available to your tester in order to execute. So you could have a table similar to this that itemizes your prerequisites, what you expect those prerequisites to be, an as found condition. Again, this is just an example. You can do this in various ways. Maybe you don't need an as found, but the reason I put this up here is one example of a prerequisite is, or could be, that your test is going to verify at some point that you produce a file and it's going to be found in this location. So maybe as an as found condition, you want the tester before they start testing to verify that that file location is empty, right? So that could be your as found condition, and then you want someone to verify, yes, it's empty, I can go ahead and start, because maybe if there's a file in there, you want to get rid of that file first, right? So these are one way to handle your prerequisites. This image shows how you could address the other aspects of setup before you get into the actual testing. So you can have an objective there, so your tester has an idea of what the objective is that they're going to execute. The procedure, those steps there, that's not the procedure for the tester to follow to prove anything. What that procedure is there for, or what it's best used for, is to help the tester understand what they need to do in general. So like you see there, complete the test steps, write actual results, and then complete the test steps as defined in the next table, the data sheet. So it gives a little bit more color and context to what they're going to do. If you need references to execute your scripts, it's good to have that in a template as well, so that maybe you need to indicate what SOPs someone needs to follow, or work instructions, or a manual, anything like that that you want to have available, and then a place to put your acceptance criteria. What you see there is a pretty simplistic one. Actual results are the same as the expected results, but maybe you have acceptance criteria for resulting values for the rest of the script. And so you could put that here to say, all actual result values must be within plus or minus X%, or it must be within this range, right? So you can indicate your overall acceptance criteria.